What if the first woman in human history was never Eve? What if, before the garden became a story about temptation, there was already tension there, already disagreement, already distance? A woman whose name almost never appears in most sermons, but whose shadow has survived for thousands of years. Some say she was Adam's first wife. Some say she became a demon of the night. Some call her rebellion. Others call her misunderstood. And some believe she represents the part of the beginning we were never meant to focus on too closely. Her name? Lilith. And the deeper you look, the stranger everything becomes, because if Lilith came before Eve, then maybe the beginning of human story was never as simple as we were taught. This is Jess Curious, and tonight we're stepping into one of the oldest unanswered questions hiding near the beginning. Maybe one of the strangest things about Lilith is what her story suggests. That conflict may have existed almost immediately. Not war, not violence, but disagreement. The kind that begins quietly when two beings try to understand who they are and what they are to each other. If the very first relationship in legend already carried tension, what does that say about us? Was questioning always there? Was doubt always there? Because before history gives us kingdoms, betrayal, religion, or division, some stories suggest two voices already stood facing one another, asking the same question differently. And maybe that matters because paradise is often imagined as perfect, but even in paradise, story still place choice, difference, and misunderstanding near the center. If you grew up hearing Adam and Eve, you probably never heard Lilith mentioned clearly. That's because in most Christian teachings, she doesn't appear in Genesis by name. The earliest roots of her name appear far older than the Bible itself. Ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Sumer, ancient Babylon. There, names like Lilith to appear. Night spirits, wind spirits, female figures associated with darkness, wilderness, and the unseen. Already we notice something important. Lilith does not begin in Eden. She begins in older human fear and older human imagination. Storms, night, things people could feel but not explain. And over centuries, those older figures slowly blended into later religious storytelling. Then much later comes one of the most discussed texts connected to her, the Alphabet of Ben Sira. Not scripture, not accepted biblical canon, but Jewish folklore. And this text tells a story most people know today. Lilith was created at the same time as Adam, from the same dust, not after him, not from him, with him. And that one idea changes everything, because if two humans came from the same earth, if both opened their eyes under the same sky, if both took their first breath from the same divine beginning, then hierarchy becomes a question almost immediately. Not because someone wanted conflict, but because difference often reveals itself the moment two minds begin to exist side by side. Who leads? Who decides? Who bends? Who speaks first? Who defines what harmony looks like? And maybe that is why this legend has survived for so long. Because whether Lilith was ever literally there or not, the story captures something deeply human. Even at the imagined beginning of everything, people wondered whether equality and peace naturally arrived together, or whether every relationship from the very start must first pass through misunderstanding. According to legend, Adam believed order required one role. Lilith believed being made equally meant standing equally, and if both believed they were right, then perhaps the first fracture was not anger. Perhaps it was expectation. The quiet moment when two beings realized they understood themselves differently. And maybe that is what makes this story feel strangely modern, because even now, so many conflicts begin exactly there. Not with hatred, but with two people asking the same questions differently. And if questioning existed this early in human legend, maybe doubt was never the enemy of the story. Maybe it was always part of it. Now, people often ask, if Lilith is so famous, why isn't she clearly written in the Bible? The answer is complicated. In Genesis, no direct names, but one possible reference appears in the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah 34:14, describing a ruined wilderness, one Hebrew word appears that some scholars connect to Lilith. Depending on translation, it becomes night creature, screech owl, night monster, or Lilith. One word, many meanings, and this matters because ancient translation is never simple. Hebrew becomes Greek, Greek becomes Latin, and Latin becomes English. And because it appears only once in the Hebrew Bible, scholars still debate what Isaiah meant. Was it a known spirit, a night bird, a poetic symbol? Isaiah does not tell the later Lilith story. It gives only a shadow, and later generations built much more around that shadow. Picture the garden before Eve, fresh earth, new breath, two beings seeing everything for the first time. No history yet, no memory, no examples of how relationships are supposed to work. Just two newly created lives trying to understand themselves and each other. According to folklore, Adam and Lilith stood side by side because they were made the same way. Equal beginning, equal dust, equal first breath, and that detail is what gives this legend so much power. Because if both were formed from the same earth, then neither enter the story carrying a visible difference in origin. No one arrives first, no one is formed later, no one is described as coming from the other. And that creates tension immediately because equality in origin does not always create harmony in relationship. Sometimes it creates expectation, sometimes it creates uncertainty, sometimes it forces two people to answer a question neither one knows how to answer yet. What does partnership look like when no model exists? And according to the legend, that tension first appeared during intimacy. Adam expected dominance, Lilith refused. She answered, "We were both made from the same earth." And that sentence survives because it feels larger than the moment itself. It feels like more than argument, more than disagreement. It feels like principle. Because what she is really saying is, if we began the same, why should one stand above the other? And that became the center of her legend. The first refusal, the first boundary, the first moment someone in the story says no. And maybe that is why this myth stayed alive, because boundaries often become memorable long after harmony is forgotten. Now imagine hearing this story in the ancient world. A female figure refusing male authority would not sound small. It would sound disruptive, unsettling, even dangerous, especially in cultures where order was often tied directly to disobedience. And that may explain why later versions of Lilith do not leave her simply as independent. They transform her, because stories often reshape difficult figures into warnings. But before that transformation, before the demon stories, before the night fear, there is simply this: two beings in a garden, both newly alive, both certain they understand dignity, and neither willing to surrender their meaning of it. And maybe the first fracture was not hatred. Maybe it was expectation meeting expectation, and neither moving first. And maybe that is why this story still feels modern, because even now, many conflicts begin not with cruelty, but with two people believing fairness means two different things. The deeper question may not be whether Adam and Lilith argued. The deeper question is, why ancient storytellers preserve that argument at all? Because ancient stories do not usually keep small disagreements unless they represent something larger. And this one clearly did. Because from the earliest human myths, one pattern appears again and again: questioning, difference, resistance. A moment when one voice does not simply accept what the other voice believes should happen. Lilith refuses Adam. Later, Eve questions what she is told. And that is interesting because before there are cities, laws, kingdoms, or religion as we know it, stories already place questions near the center of human beginnings. Maybe because ancient people understood something modern people still struggle with. Questions always change outcomes. Questions create movement. Questions disturb what feels settled. And once a question is spoken aloud, the story usually cannot return to what it was before. That may be why Lilith's refusal matters so much in legend, because once she says no, Eden is no longer simple. According to folklore, the turning point comes when Lilith speaks the secret name of God. Now, this part carries enormous symbolic weight. In ancient tradition, the true divine name was not casual language, it was sacred, powerful, protected. To speak it meant access to something far beyond ordinary speech. So when Lilith speaks that name, the legend suggests more than rebellion. It suggests knowledge, agency, a choice made with awareness, and immediately after speaking it, she leaves. Not pushed out, not cursed first, not expelled by force. She chooses to leave. That matters because chosen exile is very different from punishment. One means rejection, the other means self-removal. And myths often treat self-removal as especially powerful because it says, I would rather enter uncertainty than remain where I no longer agree. She leaves the garden and goes towards the Red Sea, According to later folklore, Lilith's leaving did not end the story. It began a new one. Because once she left the garden, the legend says God sent 3 angels after her. Their names are often given as Senoi, Sentinoi, and Samagaloth. And even their names become important later because families would one day write those names on protective amulets, believing that they could keep Lilith away. But before all of that fear came later, first comes this image. 3 messengers sent into the wilderness, sent to find the woman who left, sent to ask, some versions say demand, that she return. And if angels were sent after her, then even in folklore, her leaving was not treated as small. It was serious enough to require intervention. The garden had been disrupted, the first order had fractured, and according to legend, the angels found her near the Red Sea, a place already heavy with symbolism. Water, distance, uncertainty, wilderness, and there they gave her a choice, return or face consequences. But she refused, again. And this second refusal is what deepens her legend, because the first refusal was toward Adam. This second refusal is now toward heaven itself. And whether literal or symbolic, ancient listeners would hear that very differently. The story no longer sounds like a disagreement between 2 people. Now it sounds like someone standing outside the order everyone else expects. And that is often the point where myths begin to transform into a figure, because stories tend to ask, what do we do with someone who will not come back? Some legends say Lilith had already chosen separation completely. Some later versions claim she had joined herself to wilderness spirits. Others say she simply would not surrender what she had already decided. And because folklore rarely stays still, this is where her image begins changing. Slowly at first, then dramatically. The woman who once argued in Eden became, in later stories, a figure of the night, a being associated with darkness, a warning near sleeping children, a presence feared around newborns, and this sudden darkening raises one of the most important questions in the whole legend. Why? Because ancient stories often become darkest around figures who cannot be easily placed. A woman who leaves expected order does not fit neatly inside simple categories, and over time, many cultures transform difficult female figures into cautionary ones. Not always because they were evil, but because they represented something unsettling. Freedom outside accepted structure, and fear often fills spaces people do not fully understand. That may be why Lilith becomes linked to night, to shadows, to sleep, to things unseen, because night itself has always carried human uncertainty. Things happen there that cannot be controlled. Things imagined there become larger, and myths often place difficult figures exactly there. So before Lilith became feared, she may simply have been unresolved. A figure ancient storytellers did not know how to comfortably close. And maybe that's why later generations darkened her image, because unfinished figures often become frightened when stories keep passing through fearful hands. And maybe once Lilith was no longer inside the garden, the world began deciding what kind of story she should become. But here's where the story becomes difficult to ignore. Up to this point, Lilith could still be read as a woman who left, a woman who disagreed, a woman who would not return, but almost immediately her image changes. She becomes feared. And that raises a difficult question. Why do so many old stories do this? Why does the woman who walk away so often become dangerous later? Why does refusal become threat? And why does Eve appear only after Lilith disappears? Because once you notice that, Genesis starts to feel layered. After Lilith leaves, Genesis tells us Eve is created. Not from dust, but from Adam's rib. That symbol changed the emotional shape of the story. Eve is connected to Adam differently, and many scholars point out something curious. Genesis contains 2 creation patterns. Genesis 1:27 says male and female together. Genesis 2:22 says women from the man. 2 tellings, 2 structures, 2 possibilities. Some people believe Lilith fills that space. Others say it's simply 2 literary styles combined, and both views deserve space. Because the truth is, Lilith as Adam's first wife belongs more to folklore than formal scripture, but folklore survives because it often expresses questions scripture leaves open. Later tradition transforms her, and this is where Lilith's story becomes darker than many people expect, because once she is outside the garden, outside order, outside return, later generations begin attaching new fears to her name. And what they attach tells us something important. important about ancient human fear, because over time, Lilith becomes linked to the moments people feared most, when they had no explanation. The night, newborn children, sleep, desire, things unseen, things uncontrollable, things deeply human. In later Jewish folklore, Lilith becomes associated with newborn babies because for most of human history, infant loss was tragically common and often unexplained. A child could seem healthy one day and be gone the next. No medicine, no clear cause, no understanding of infection, breathing disorders, or sudden illness. And when people cannot explain grief, they often give it a face. Lilith became one of those faces. Families wrote the name of the three angels, Sensoi, Sansanoi, and Samagaloth, on protective amulets and hung them near cradles. Not because everyone agreed on her story, but because fear always seeks protection. And in this case, protection became ritual. Then there is sleep. This is where Lilith becomes linked to something modern listeners instantly recognize. That terrifying feeling of waking in the night, unable to move, unable to speak, aware of a presence. For centuries before sleep paralysis had a medical name, cultures around the world explained that experience through spirits. Pressure on the chest, a shadow nearby, a sense that something is watching. In many traditions, Lilith became one explanation for that fear. Not because science supported it, but because ancient people described night terror through the language they had. And Lilith fit perfectly. A figure already tied to darkness, already tied to night, already outside ordinary human space. Then her image shifts again. Seduction enters the story. Later texts describe her as approaching men in sleep, tempting them, drawing energy from them, and again, this reflects something ancient societies often struggle to explain openly. Desire, dreams, sexual thoughts, nocturnal experiences people did not understand. Rather than seeing these only as internal human experiences, many cultures personified them. Lilith became one such figure, not because she suddenly changed, but because human fears kept finding room inside her myth. And then came the symbols. Snakes, owls, wings, night creatures. Owls appear because they belong to night. They see when others cannot. They move silently. In old cultures, owls were mysterious, not cute, but unsettling. A sound in darkness, eyes watching from where humans could not fully see. And Lilith, already tied to night, naturally absorbs owl imagery. Snakes appear because snakes were already ancient symbols of danger, knowledge, temptation, and transformation. Even when later art links Lilith to serpent, it often reflects existing symbolic language more than historical text. A woman outside order, a serpent nearby, night surrounding both. The symbolism almost writes itself, and perhaps that is why Lilith becomes larger than one story, because she became a place where many fears gathered. Fear of losing control, fear of the unseen, fear of feminine power, fear of what happens outside protected spaces. And maybe that is why she still survives, because even now, night still makes humans' imaginations larger. And some myths remain powerful because they were built from fears every generation still understands. And maybe Lilith didn't become frightening because her original story demanded it. Maybe she became frightening because human fear kept needing somewhere to place what it could not explain. And this is where Lilith becomes larger than her own story, because once you step back, you begin noticing something strange. Across many ancient myths, the names change, the cultures change, the details change, but certain patterns remain almost identical, again and again. Old stories introduce a feminine figure who carries contradiction. She is beautiful, but she's feared. Powerful, but misunderstood. Desired, but dangerous. Close to wisdom, but linked to warning. And Lilith fits that pattern so clearly that many people begin asking, did later myths inherit pieces of the same emotional blueprint? Not the same character, but the same ancient human idea. Take mermaids. Across cultures, mermaids are rarely simple sea creatures. They are often described as alluring, mysterious, and impossible to fully trust. Part human, part other, they draw attention, they invite curiosity, but they also live beyond ordinary human order. Outside land, outside settled life, outside control. And that sounds familiar. Lilith too becomes a figure outside accepted space, near wilderness, near water in some tellings, connected to mystery, attraction, and danger all at once. not because Lilith became a mermaid, but myth often repeats emotional shapes. Then there's Medusa, and Medusa may be one of the strongest comparisons because Medusa also changes dramatically depending on who tells the story. In one version, she is simply monstrous, and in another, she is transformed after violence. And over time, she becomes more than a creature. She becomes a symbol, feared face, powerful gaze, a woman whose very presence unsettles people. Like Lilith, Medusa becomes more than her first story. She becomes what later generations project onto her. Then come the sirens, beautiful voices, danger hidden inside attraction. Again, a feminine figure linked to what calls people closer, while also carrying warning. And ancient cultures repeated this pattern often. A figure who cannot simply be approached without consequence. Not always evil, not always good, but never fully safe. Then compare that to Eve, and here the contrast becomes especially interesting because Eve also stands near questioning, near choice, near knowledge. But Eve remains inside the main biblical story. Lilith moves outside of it. Eve becomes central, Lilith becomes shadow, and perhaps that alone shaped how both were remembered. One remains within accepted order, the other becomes what sits beyond it. And modern people still repeat these archetypes. Even now, many stories continue creating women who carry contradiction. Strong but criticized, independent but misunderstood, confident but called threatening, complex but simplified by others. Which is why some modern readers see Lilith not simply as ancient folklore, but as one of the oldest examples of how cultures struggle with feminine power that does not easily fit expected roles. But there is something important here. These figures survive because they are unresolved. Mermaids never fully belong to land. Medusa never fully belonged to one meaning. Sirens never become simple villains. Lilith never fully settles either. And maybe that is why they survive, because myths that remain unfinished often live the longest. They continue asking questions long after certainty disappears, and maybe the oldest repeated pattern is this. Human beings have always created stories around what they admire and do not fully understand. And often those stories wear a feminine face. And maybe that is why Lilith refuses to disappear, because whether she began as folklore, borrowed myth, symbolic warning, or forgotten interpretation, her story keeps returning whenever people begin asking difficult questions about voice, identity, and belonging. Because beneath all the night imagery, beneath the wings, the owls, the fear, the legends, there is still a very human moment at the center of her story. A voice saying no, a boundary spoken clearly, a person choosing to leave instead of forced agreement. And no matter how ancient the story becomes, people still recognize that moment, because even now, so many relationships break not because love was impossible, but because two people could not agree on what respect looked like. Two people could not define fairness the same way. Two people reached the same question and answered it differently. And that is why Lilith still feels modern, because her story is not only about myth, it touches something people still live every day. How much of yourself do you keep when a relationship asks you to become smaller? When does compromise become silence? At what point does peace mean losing yourself? And those aren't ancient questions. Those are current ones. That may be why modern readers keep returning to Lilith. Some do not see a demon at all. Some see the oldest surviving symbol of what happens when someone refuses to disappear inside someone else's expectation. Others still feel uneasy with that reading, and that tension matters too, because Lilith has never been universally comfortable. She unsettles people because she remains difficult to place, too ancient to define cleanly, too symbolic to dismiss easily, too changed by centuries of retelling to claim certainty. And perhaps that is exactly why she survives, because stories usually disappear when they are fully solved. Lilith never fully was. She remains unfinished, a name caught between scripture, folklore, fear, power, and imagination. And unfinished stories tend to live the longest, because every generation sees itself somewhere inside them. Some hear warning, some hear strength, some hear loss, some hear mystery. And maybe the reason Lilith still matters is because she asks something every age must answer for itself. What happens when a voice steps outside the story it was expected to remain inside? Because sometimes history softens that voice. Sometimes mythology darkens it. Sometimes culture rewrites it. But sometimes, even after all of that, the voice remains quiet, unsettling, still present, still asking to be heard. And maybe that is why Lilith survives. not in certainty, but in conversation. Not fully inside religion, not fully outside it, not fully villain, not fully symbol, just enough mystery to remain alive. And perhaps that is the deepest reason old stories endure. They leave enough unfinished for us to keep returning. When I first heard Lilith's story, it felt less like discovering a hidden chapter and more like hearing an old whisper, still moving through history. And maybe that's why she survives, not because everyone agrees, but because no one fully closes the question. Was she first? Was she symbolic? Was she borrowed from older myths and placed near Genesis later? Maybe all of it, maybe none of it, but the deeper question may be this: why do the oldest stories always leave room for mystery? Because maybe certainty was never the point. If Lilith had remained fully inside the main story, would we read Genesis differently today? And if conflict, questioning, and doubt appear so close to the beginning, were they always part of human nature? Or were they always part of how humans explain themselves? Tell me what you think, because sometimes the names that survive in whispers survive for a reason, and sometimes what history almost erases returns stronger in curiosity. This is Just Curious. Stay curious, not furious, and I will leave you with this affirmation. I trust my voice. I honor what feels true within me. I do not fear being misunderstood. What is mine will not require me to disappear. I remain grounded, curious, and at peace. Bye.